Hello to all. Today we will deal with management of diabetic emergencies. Uh, you all have read about and studied about and listened to uh, the diabetes mellitus, wherein the diabetes is essentially a disease where you know which is associated with glucose intolerance, maybe due to lack of insulin or due to insulin resistance. Even though diabetic mellitus is a chronic disease which develops gradually over years, sometimes when the disease is not under control, the diabetes can manifest itself as emergency situations. Okay, so we will now discuss about the pathophysiology of diabetic emergencies along with how to manage those emergencies. So, as I said, we all know that diabetes is a disorder of glucose homeostasis. And India is stated to be the diabetic capital of the world because in India, the central obesity is more when compared to the obesity pattern elsewhere, especially in the West. From this map, you can clearly see just the southern Asian region, the projected number of cases is 140 million in 2040, which is around 14 crores. So, as such, diabetes is going to be a huge burden on health resources in the future. So, it's essential that all the practitioners to know about, to learn about the disease which is diabetes mellitus and its management, especially the emergency conditions. And small introduction about the types of diabetes. Okay. In type 1 diabetes, there is a loss of insulin and which usually occurs in younger individuals, mostly due to the destruction of beta cells through antibodies. Whereas in the case of type 2 diabetes, it is usually due to insulin resistance. When we talk about emergencies, two conditions comes to our mind associated with diabetes mellitus. Okay, one is hypoglycemia, okay, and the second is emergencies associated with hyperglycemia. Okay, so you all understand that the emergency hypoglycemia is an emergency condition wherein there will be inadequate supply of glucose for the body parts to function. But it is interesting to know that even hyperglycemia, which is an excess supply of glucose, can also lead to emergency conditions. First, let us deal with the hyperglycemic diabetic emergencies, and then we will deal with the hypoglycemic diabetic emergencies. Again, when we talk about the hyperglycemia emergency, it is associated with two conditions. Two conditions come to our mind. The one is diabetic ketoacidosis. Second is hyperglycemic hyperosmolar state. Even though both the conditions sound different, they actually form a spectrum of disorder wherein diabetic ketoacidosis is at the one end of the spectrum and hyperglycemic hyperosmolar state, okay, it's on the other side. Okay, so when we talk about the epidemiology of these hyperglycemic emergencies, diabetic ketoacidosis usually occurs in patients with type 1 diabetes mellitus. and HHS usually occurs in patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus. But even when we take the type 2 diabetes mellitus, DKA occurs more often than HHS. But still, if we compare the emergency conditions in type 1 and type 2, HHS occurs more common in type 2 diabetes mellitus. Yeah. So as I said, but overall speaking, diabetic ketoacidosis is more common than HHS. But HHS is more fatal than DKA. That is more important. Even though both are emergency conditions and both can be fatal, but it is very difficult to control HHS compared to DKA. Now let's talk about the pathophysiology of these emergency conditions. We all know that, as I previously said, the diabetes mellitus is associated with either the lack of insulin or insulin resistance. Both will lead to an imbalance in the glucose homeostasis. Basically, be it lack of insulin resistance or the lack of be it the lack of insulin or the presence of insulin resistance, both will lead to failure in the reduction of blood glucose. Okay, so insulin deficiency is the foremost important reason regarding the pathophysiology of this emergency conditions. When glucagon excess is added to this process, it actually speeds up the emergencies. Even though in many diabetic emergency conditions, glucagon excess might not be a thing. Okay, so as expected, the lack of insulin or insulin resistance will manifest as hyperglycemia. Especially in HHS, the blood glucose levels can be more than 800 milligram per deciliter, and it can sometimes exceed 1000 milligram per deciliter, whereas in DKA it's usually below 800 milligram per deciliter, and often it's around 350 to 400 milligram per deciliter. So again, when we talk about the pathophysiology, lack of insulin will lead to glucose excess. Okay, and when there is an excess of glucose in the blood, and when the blood is filtered in the glomerular apparatus in the kidneys, the glucose is always filtered, but it's generally reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubules mostly, but it is reabsorbed throughout the tubule length. But there is a threshold limit for this glucose absorption. When the plasma concentration of glucose is more, this threshold limit is breached and the glucose starts appearing in the urine. Okay, and presence of urinary glucose is there for even stable diabetic patients where the diabetes is not under control. But sometimes what happens is, when the blood glucose is really high, as in the case of HHS or DKA, when it reaches up to 600 or 800 milligram per deciliter, this excess glucose drags in the body fluid. Okay, when it drags the body fluid along with it, that will cause dehydration. You know, when the process is triggered, it becomes vicious. Dehydration will lead to further more dehydration, okay, and the condition spirals up. The fluid loss amounts to 10 or 15 liters, okay. So such a dehydration is usually detrimental to the body, okay. And this dehydration is not just associated with the extracellular fluid, because more glucose is present in the blood, the plasma osmolality increases. When the plasma osmolality increases, it starts sucking the fluid out of the cells, blood cells. Not only blood cells, all the cells of the body, including the cells of the brain. So this eventually leads to even intracellular dehydration, okay. So one of the first and foremost, and you can even say very important manifestation of these diabetic emergencies, be DKA or HHS, it is the fluid loss, which is dehydration. Okay, then let us see what are the other manifestations of the diabetic emergencies. The first is dehydration, and second is, again, it is due to insulin deficiency. When there is insulin deficiency, even though the plasma glucose increases, insulin is required for the cells to for glucose uptake. Almost all the cells in the bodies require insulin for glucose uptake, if you remember the biochemistry classes, okay, except the brain cells and the exercising muscles, okay. Insulin is required for glucose utilization. So even though lot of glucose is present in the plasma, this insulin deficiency will not allow this glucose to be utilized properly, okay. So because the glucose is not utilized properly, to meet the ATP demand, there will be increased lipolysis in the body, which leads to increased acyl-CoA in the liver and increased acetyl-CoA in the cytoplasm. This acetyl-CoA goes into the Krebs cycle in the mitochondria, and this Krebs cycle of mitochondria also has certain limits. The excess amount of acetyl-CoA found in the cytoplasm cannot just be pushed into the Krebs cycle to form ATP. So there will be excess of acetyl-CoA in the cytoplasm, and it will eventually form ketone bodies. Either it forms acetone, and it might be hydroxylated to form hydroxybutyric acid. So basically, and this will be released into the plasma. So in diabetic emergencies, there will be increased ketone bodies and hydroxybutyric acid in the plasma. And because the amount of hydroxybutyric acid is increased in the plasma, as the name suggests, because of the increased presence of acid in the plasma, it will eventually lead to acidosis. First, there will be dehydration. Second, there will be acidosis. Okay. Now, as I said, the acidosis is nothing but an elevated anion gap metabolic acidosis. if you see the formula for serum anion gap, which is nothing but serum sodium minus serum chloride plus bicarbonate. Okay, here because of the excess presence of hydroxybutyric acid, the bicarbonate is consumed to compensate for the acidity, so the bicarbonate levels are decreased, and according to this formula this will lead to an elevated anion gap. Yeah. And we already saw that there is an elevated keto acids. Okay. And this keto acids will be eventually excreted in urine also, causing ketonuria. So dehydration, metabolic acidosis, elevated anion gap metabolic acidosis, and ketonuria is a future. Okay. Basically these things, ketonuria, acidosis and all, will be less pronounced if the volumetric status is a little bit normal, if the dehydration is not more. Otherwise this dehydration exacerbates this metabolic acidosis and ketonuria. So as I already said, the increase in the plasma glucose eventually leads to an increase in the plasma osmolality levels. It's more pronounced with HHS. It's understood because in HHS the amount of glucose is more than 800 milligram per deciliter, and sometimes it can cross even 1000 milligram per deciliter. But it is relatively less pronounced with increase in the plasma osmolality is relatively less pronounced in DKA when compared to HHS, but definitely it is increased in DKA also. Now again, as I previously said, this hyperosmolality pulls the intracellular fluid, okay, and thereby it reduces the plasma sodium concentration. So basically there will be a hyponatremia associated with the dehydration. Now, so let us summarize the biochemical findings in DKA and HHS. DKA is usually divided into mild, moderate and severe form, whereas there is only one form of HHS. When we see the plasma glucose levels, it's in the order of greater than 250 in all the three divisions, mild, moderate and severe, but it is more than 600 or 800 in HHS. When we talk about in millimole per liters, it is greater than 13.9 in DKA and greater than 33.3 in HHS. Yes, arterial pH. Metabolic acidosis is more pronounced in DKA. DKA stands for diabetic ketoacidosis. So acidosis is more pronounced in DKA, especially in the severe form. You can see the pH falls below 7, whereas in HHS it is usually more than 7.3. Basically it's almost physiological. Again, when we talk about the bicarbonate concentration, because the acidosis is less pronounced in HHS, the bicarbonate levels are greater than 18 milliequivalents per liter in HHS, whereas in severe forms of DKA it is less than 10. Urinary ketones are always present in DKA, whereas it's either negligible or not present in HHS. Serum ketones again is present in all forms of DKA, but it's present or absent in HHS. If we talk about the quantification of serum ketones in DKA, in mild forms it is between 3 to 4 millimoles per liter, whereas in severe form it is greater than 8 millimoles per liter. In HHS it is usually less than 0.6 millimole per liter. Serum osmolality. Now HHS is an hyperosmolar state, so we expect that the serum osmolality is increased more in HHS when compared to DKA. That is why, because of the increased serum osmolality, there will be too much of dehydration associated with, dehydration of brain, which is again associated with the neurological complications when compared to DKA. Neurological complications occur in DKA also, but in HHS it is more because of increased osmolality and dehydration. So that is why HHS is more fatal. Again, if we talk about anion gap, in severe forms of DKA it is more than 12, whereas HHS it is negligible. Again, because we already saw that the bicarbonate is not decreased so much and pH is maintained more than 7.3 in HHS. Again, alteration in sensoria. Usually in mild forms the patient is alert, whereas in moderate form the patient is drowsy. In severe form the patient goes into coma, and HHS the patient invariably goes into coma if not managed on time. Again, so apart from dehydration, ketonuria, acidity, sodium loss, there is also loss of potassium, net loss of potassium. Okay, you all should remember, insulin always pushes the potassium into the cells, so the lack of insulin causes potassium leakage from the cells. Okay, so as the potassium starts leaking from the cells, the excess potassium is generally excreted in the urine, so there will be net potassium loss. But sometimes what happens is this net potassium loss will not be manifested in the serum potassium levels, the plasma potassium levels. Okay, you can understand, loss of potassium is due to osmotic diuresis, because there is osmotic diuresis due to excess glucose, it will drag sodium and potassium along with them. Not only that, there will be also, because of dehydration, there will be increased secretion of aldosterone, which can also trigger potassium loss. And sometimes this keto acid binds to serum potassium and again drags potassium with it during this ketonuria. So this also causes potassium loss. Okay. But as I already said, there will be net potassium loss because of the leakage of potassium from the cells, which will be excreted in the urine, but it will not be reflected properly in the serum. Okay, because this is essential during management. Okay, because once you start giving insulin to manage these patients, there will be certainly sudden fall of potassium, and hypokalemia is associated with various cardiac conduction abnormalities. It will eventually lead to arrhythmia. Okay, the patient may be stabilized, but the patient might eventually succumb to arrhythmia. Yeah, as I already told, insulin is essential for the potassium uptake into the cells along with the glucose, so lack of insulin will cause potassium loss. As I already said, there will be osmotic movement from ICF to ECF. So there will be loss of water and other electrolytes also. Okay, so you can see the loss of various electrolytes associated with DKA and HHS. Around 6 liters of water is lost in DKA, whereas around 9 liters of water is lost in HHS. When it comes to milliliter per kg, it is around 100 milliliter for DKA, it's around 200 milliliter for HHS. 7 to 10 milliequivalents per kg of sodium is lost, whereas 5 to 13 milliequivalent per kg of sodium is lost in HHS. If you see potassium loss is also more in HHS. Phosphate loss is more in DKA, and there will be equal amount of magnesium and calcium loss also. Again, these are all due to osmotic dehydration. Osmotic dehydration pulls everything with it. Okay, but still, magnesium and calcium, there will be some feedback mechanisms to bring them to normal, and usually they don't require specific management unless there is sharp decrease or really bigger decrease in these magnesium and calcium levels. Okay, so we all saw about this pathophysiology of diabetic emergencies, diabetic ketoacidosis or HHS. So if insulin deficiency is the cause, okay, there should be many cases, okay, but usually apparently healthy individuals with controlled diabetes, this doesn't happen. There is always a triggering factor. Okay, the major triggering factor for the diabetic emergencies, especially DKA, is infection. Remember this, a diabetic patient can be completely under control, but some infection will trigger both insulin deficiency and insulin resistance, and especially it triggers insulin resistance a lot. Then that will spiral up to form DKA. Okay, so you can see the various predisposing factors for DKA. It's actually inadequate insulin treatment or non-compliance, occurs usually in new onset diabetes patients, infection which contributes around 40% of the DKA, cerebrovascular accident, myocardial infarction, acute pancreatitis. Basically anything which induces stress, infection induces stress, cerebrovascular accident induces stress, myocardial infarction induces stress, acute pancreatitis induces stress. So anything which induces stress will lead to DKA. Moreover, there are certain drugs which can contribute to the pathophysiology of which can trigger DKA, which are clozapine, olanzapine, cocaine, lithium. Interestingly, SGLT2 inhibitors, which are used in the management of diabetes mellitus, can trigger DKA paradoxically. Then we have terbutaline. For HHS also, the major causes infection. Around 60% of the HHS is due to infection. Again, there will be inadequate insulin treatment or non-compliance, and the infections might be due to pneumonia or urinary tract infection or sepsis and various other stressful conditions like cerebral vascular accident, myocardial infarction, acute pancreatitis, acute pulmonary embolus, intestinal obstruction, dialysis, mesenteric thrombosis, renal failure, heat stroke, hypothermia, subdural hematoma, and severe burns. Okay, so how will be the clinical presentation of the patient? Okay, mild DKA, the patient will be usually alert. Okay, but when it comes to severe forms, there will be various signs and symptoms of dehydration. Okay, DKA usually develops rapidly over the period of 24 hours, whereas HHS develops slowly over several days. Okay, So apart from the signs of dehydration, there will be neurologic symptoms because of the increased osmolality, that is intracerebral fluid, or you can say that the cells inside the neurons in the brain undergo dehydration, which might cause stupor, coma, seizures, and usually it's more common in HHS. So the range of neurological symptoms may vary from mental obtundation to coma. So not only the signs of dehydration will be present, along with neurological symptoms, we have other features like abdominal pain, because this DKA and metabolic acidosis will induce ileus, so this will cause abdominal pain. As I already said, there will be signs of volume depletion, and there will be a typical acidotic or ketotic breath. That acidotic or ketotic smell will be there in the breath of the patients. Even if you go near the patient, sometimes you can, what to say, feel the smell or sense the smell. And of course, since infection is the foremost reason for the pathophysiology of diabetic emergencies, we have the signs of underlying illnesses, especially if the patient has pneumonia. The chest X-ray will typically show infections, okay? Or if there is urinary tract infections, there will be bacterial growth in the urine culture, all those things. Yeah, now comes the management part. Okay. So the cardinal features of this diabetic emergencies are the cardinal features of hyperglycemic diabetic emergencies are dehydration, ketonuria, acidosis, okay, potassium loss, sodium loss, okay, and hyperglycemia. Yeah, that is. So we should take care of all these abnormalities to manage the patients. Of course, since it's an emergency condition, we should always first stabilize the airway, breathing and circulation. If the patient is in coma, then we need to intubate them, okay, then secure a good IV access using 16 gauge needle. Because of dehydration, we have to pump in a lot of fluid, okay. And there are certain things which has to be monitored regularly, and the management should be changed accordingly. That is, we need to monitor Hartley serum glucose, basic electrolytes, venous pH or bicarbonate, okay, glucose Hartley, and all the other things every 2 to 4 hours until the patient is stable. And again, do not forget, along with the stabilization and management of all those cardinal features, we always have to try to find the trigger. Once the patient starts stabilizing, we should try to find the trigger and then treat the trigger also, because if the trigger is not treated, a stable you will put a lot of effort to stabilize the patient, but if the trigger is not treated, the patient may again go into coma or diabetic ketoacidosis or HHS. So the first and foremost, even though it is a diabetic emergency associated with hyperglycemia, we have to take care of dehydration. Then we need to worry about the glucose levels. So the dehydration here is more detrimental than the elevated glucose levels. Okay. So there should be vigorous IV electrolyte and fluid replacement. Since there is both water and sodium loss, we will start with normal saline. Okay. 0.9% sodium chloride, normal saline. If the patient is in shock, then there should be rapid infusion of fluids. If the patient is without shock, start with 20 milligram per kg per hour of sodium chloride normal saline infusion, and it can be increased up to maximum of 50 milliliter per kg per hour for the first 2 to 4 hours. So after infusing the fluid for 2 to 4 hours, then we need to assess the fluid and electrolyte status. If the sodium level shows less than 135 milliequivalent per liter, the saline should be continued. But if the sodium levels normalize or go above 135 milliequivalent per liter, okay, then the normal saline has to be switched to half normal saline. Okay, now of course, all this management is simultaneous. Okay, once you start the fluid, okay, you should not wait for the dehydration to be managed first. Okay, the dehydration, the fluid infusion will take care of the dehydration. So in the meantime, you will start treating the hyperglycemia also with intravenous insulin. Okay, so while managing the fluid, the dehydration, when the glucose level falls below 200 milligram per liter per deciliter in DKA or 300 milligram per deciliter in HHS, we need to start adding dextrose along with the fluid. Okay, because it's not recommended for a sharp fall of glucose, because the body is accustomed to increased glucose levels. So if there is a sharp fall in glucose also, it will lead to problem. Okay, so we need to start adding dextrose when the blood glucose reaches 200 milligram per deciliter in DKA or 250 to 300 milligram per deciliter in HHS, and then later on we can reduce it to normal once the patient stabilizes. Okay, again, of course, when the patient is in shock, there should be rapid infusion, but the patient is not in shock, it's always better to maintain 50 milliliter per kg per hour infusion, because if we infuse more than that, that will cause cerebral edema, because dehydration will induce production of certain osmotic crystals in the brain cells. Okay, so that will again fight with the increased osmolality in the plasma so that it can retain the fluid. Okay, and these crystals take time to dissolve. So if there is rapid correction of dehydration, so there will be again increased osmotic force favoring the entry of water into the cells, because this crystals are still intact in the neurons, so that will cause cerebral edema. So we should have to allow some time for these crystals to disintegrate in the neurons so that we can prevent cerebral edema. Okay. And moreover, this volume correction will always enhance the response to insulin, which will be going on simultaneously. If the dehydration is not corrected, whatever insulin you give, it will not lead to the fall of glucose levels. Now, along with the management of dehydration, we should take care of the potassium levels. Okay, so in the previous slides we saw how the sodium and water is taken care of. Now we need to see how the potassium is taken care of. Okay, potassium replacement is initiated immediately when the serum potassium falls less than 5.3 milliequivalent per liter. Basically, along with the normal saline you will start injecting KCl solution into the normal saline bottles. So potassium chloride of 20 to 40 milliequivalents per hour in saline until it reaches 5. So potassium salts added to the IV fluids have the same osmotic effect as sodium. So this has to be taken care when we want to correct the osmolality. Okay. So now we have taken care of dehydration, that is water. We have taken care of sodium. We have taken care of potassium. Now it's time to take care of the glucose levels. Of course, everything, the pathophysiology, hyperglycemia is a major part in this pathophysiology. So we have to start insulin after we secure the IV line, and after we start the fluids, and after assessing the potassium levels and giving potassium, we should start the insulin. Okay. So immediate insulin if the serum potassium is greater than 3.3 milliequivalents per liter. But if the potassium is less than 3.3 milliequivalents per liter, it's always better to correct the potassium levels first and then start the insulin, because once you, as I already told, once you start giving insulin, it will start pushing the potassium into the cells. So hypokalemia will be exacerbated. It will cause cardiac arrhythmias. Regular insulin is preferred because only regular insulin can be given intravenously. Other forms of insulin cannot be given intravenously. Okay. So insulin replacement corrects hyperglycemia. By correcting hyperglycemia, it can also correct ketoacidosis, because once insulin is administered, that will enable the cells to utilize glucose. It will prevent lipolysis. If the lipolysis is prevented, automatically ketosis is also reduced and ketonuria will subside. So as I already told, insulin pushes potassium into the cells. It will also correct the potassium loss. So first there should be we need to provide an IV bolus of regular insulin, which is 0.1 unit per kg body weight. After the bolus, then we need to go for a continuous infusion of regular insulin of 0.1 per units per kg per hour. Okay. So at every hour, the glucose level should fall around 50 to 70 milligram per liter. If it's not falling in this range, double the insulin dose in the next hour. So as I already told, when the glucose level reaches 200 milligram per deciliter in DKA or 250 to 300 milligram per deciliter in HHS, we need to add dextrose in the saline. But once the patient is stabilized, when there is no, when the potassium loss is replenished, when the fluid loss is replenished, when the sodium loss is replenished, when the metabolic acidosis is corrected, later on we can bring the blood glucose levels back to normal. Okay. Until then, the blood glucose levels should be maintained around 200 in DKA and 300 in HHS. If the patient is stabilizing well, decrease the insulin infusion at the rate of 0.05 unit per kg per hour. As I said, do not allow the glucose to fall below these levels until the signs and symptoms of DK and HHS resolves, to prevent cerebral edema. Last but not the least, as I already told, treat the underlying cause, usually infection. So start empirical antibiotics, and after the culture and sensitivity report, give the proper antibiotics. Treat the precipitating factor, usual infection. But if there are other precipitating factors like cerebral infarction, then the treatment protocol as per the various guidelines has to be implemented. On discharge, once the patient is able to eat, switch from IV to subcutaneous insulin and adjust according to the response, like the usual management of diabetes mellitus. Yes, so if the underlying condition is resolved, then you can discharge the patient. What about the other abnormalities? See, until now we have not addressed the acidosis problem, because once we address the dehydration, the sodium depletion, the potassium depletion, the hyperglycemia, acidosis will get automatically corrected. But sometimes what happens is, if the pH is really below 6.9, then sodium bicarbonate has to be given, injected. Okay, right. So during the management of the diabetic emergencies, there are various parameters to be monitored. First is plasma osmolality, then we need to monitor the glucose levels, and we need to monitor the hydration levels, sodium levels, urinary output, potassium levels, and pH. So this has to be monitored regularly until the patient is stabilized. Okay, until now we saw the management of hyperglycemic diabetic emergencies. Now we will talk about hypoglycemia. It's straightforward. Hypoglycemia manifests in seconds to minutes, and the only option is to provide glucose to correct the hypoglycemia. Usually hypoglycemia manifests itself as Whipple's triad, that is symptoms which are consistent with hypoglycemia, that is there will be drowsiness, neurological symptoms, low blood glucose, and resolution of symptoms once the blood glucose levels normalize. Hypoglycemia manifests when the blood glucose falls less than 60 mg per deciliter. It's usually due to over management, that is 27% of type 1 diabetes patients on intensive insulin regimens develops severe hypoglycemia annually. In normal individuals, it will never go below 3 millimole per liter, but when you keep on giving excessive insulin, extrinsic insulin, then the glucose levels might fall below 3 millimole per liter. As I already told, one of the major reasons for hyperglycemia is over-management of diabetes mellitus, and sometimes, very rarely, it is due to uncontrolled insulin secretion from tumors, beta cell tumors, or various other neuroendocrine tumors. Sometimes very severe illness, antibody to insulin, cortisol deficiency, and malnourishment can also cause hypoglycemia. And there are certain drugs also which can attribute to hypoglycemia or which can accelerate hypoglycemia. First and foremost is insulin, which we all know, then sulfonylureas, which are insulin secretagogues and thereby can induce hypoglycemia. Thiazolidinediones, okay. Then drugs exacerbating hyperglycemia, ethanol, salicylates, NSAIDs, pentamidine, ACE inhibitors, lithium chloride, theophylline, bromocriptine, mebendazole. Clinical features, as we already saw, there will be Whipple's triad, then there will be neurogenic and neuroglycopenic symptoms. Neurogenic symptoms are because of direct manifestations of lack of glucose in the brain, like seizures, coma. And neuroglycopenic symptoms because there will be lesser glucose, there will be autonomic response like palpitations, or like palpitations and other features, especially it is palpitations. So these are the various conditions associated with hypoglycemia, okay, because there might be due to hypoglycemia due to exogenous insulin, hypoglycemia due to insulinoma, hypoglycemia due to oral hypoglycemic agents, insulin or hypoglycemia due to insulin autoantibodies, hypoglycemia due to IGF, and hypoglycemia which might be non-insulin mediated. But for everything, the management is give glucose. So agents to treat hypoglycemia, as usual, if the patient is stable, give oral glucose. If the patient is unstable, give IV glucose. And sometimes if the hypoglycemia is very severe, then we can administer glucagon along with the IV glucose. 1 milligram is administered intravenously, intramuscularly, or subcutaneously. If the hypoglycemia is associated with insulinomas, then we need to give diazoxide, because the effect is directly opposite to sulfonylureas, 3 to 8 milligram per kg per day in adults. Okay, and T half of this agent is around 48 hours. So how to prevent hypoglycemia? Just try not to manage the glucose levels aggressively. That itself will reduce the hypoglycemia to a greater extent. Then individualize the insulin therapy. So that's all about the pathophysiology and management of various diabetic emergencies. Thank you.